the 27th of August, 1569. In a hall inside the Vatican, a duke from Florence kneels in front of a pope. He is not being crowned king. He's asked for that title twice already, and been turned down twice. Once by Pope Paul IV, once more by Pope Pius IV. Neither man dared hand a subject of the Holy Roman Emperor a royal crown. That right belonged to the emperor alone, and everyone in that hall knew it. So the current Pope, Pius V, does something else instead. He invents a new one. Cosimo de' Medici rises from that floor as Grand Duke of Tuscany, granted the honorific Altezza Serenissima, Most Serene Highness, alongside it. Before this afternoon, neither title existed anywhere in Europe. Months later, Pius crowns him with his own hands, using a grand ducal crown built specifically for the occasion, in a ceremony that, by every rule of the Holy Roman Empire, only the emperor had the standing to perform. 400 miles north, in Vienna, Emperor Maximilian II hears about it and is furious. Florence, he says, is an imperial fief. The Pope had no authority to grant anything at all. Philip II of Spain, his cousin, agrees. So, quietly, do the other Italian duchies. Several of them simply refuse to use Cosimo's new title for years. This is not a story about a crown. This is not a story about a coronation. This is not, really, even a story about Cosimo de' Medici. This is a story about a workaround. The first time in European history, a title got manufactured, on the spot, for the specific purpose of getting around a rule about who was and wasn't allowed to be a king. And here's the strange part. Cosimo was not the last powerful man in Europe who wanted a crown and ended up holding this one instead. Centuries later, and well over 1,000 miles northeast of Florence, another ruler will spend the better part of his reign chasing an actual coronation of his own, and lose it, in the end, by a matter of days. Hold on to that. We're coming back to him. Leave that name filed for later. To understand how he ends up standing exactly where Cosimo just stood, we need to go back much further than either of them. Back to what the word duke meant before anyone bolted the word grand onto the front of it. Dux. That's where it starts. Latin for leader, originally just a job title, handed to Roman military commanders posted along a dangerous stretch of frontier. No throne attached. No hereditary claim. Just, you command this region, keep the peace. Answer to Rome. When Rome fell, the barbarian kingdoms that replaced it kept the word and gave it a very different job. In France, and in Germany especially, a duke stopped being a commander on loan from the capital and became something closer to a regional strongman, ruling a large stretch of territory in his own right, often barely answering to anyone. By the high Middle Ages, duke sat near the top of the pile, below king, above nearly everyone else. In 1356, the Holy Roman Empire's Golden Bull handed a small group of elite princes, the electors, privileges that put them, on paper, above even the dukes. The Austrian dukes didn't love that. Their solution was to simply invent a bigger title for themselves, Archduke, which tells you something important before we've even reached the word grand. This title had already been inflated once, by people who didn't like where they'd landed in the pecking order. So here's the actual premise of this video, laid out plainly instead of teased. Grand Duke is not one title. It's not even one system, wearing one label across a few centuries. It is, by the most conservative count, 5 completely different jobs. A sovereign monarch, a medieval warlord turned statesman, a French emperor's party favor, a birth certificate with a salary attached, and one left over that happens to still be running a country right now. And every one of them got filed under the same 3 English words. If you've ever read a Russian novel, or an old newspaper headline, or a Wikipedia info box, and pictured every Grand Duke as basically a miniature king, you were half right. Maybe a fifth of the time. We're going to sort out which fifth, one system at a time. And the mystery man from a minute ago is going to be exactly the hinge where 2 of those systems collide. Back to Florence for a moment, because Cosimo's story doesn't end at his coronation. It gets harder from there. For years after 1569, Grand Duke of Tuscany is a title that half of Europe treats as a rumor. The Habsburgs won't use it in official correspondence. Rival Italian courts pointedly address him as plain Duke, as though the ceremony in Rome had simply never taken place. Cosimo dies in 1574, still fighting for recognition that, strictly speaking, should have been automatic the moment a pope declared it. His son Francesco inherits not just a title, but an argument. Eventually the argument is won mostly by attrition. Tuscany keeps calling itself a Grand Duchy for so long, and so consistently, that the rest of Europe simply runs out of energy to keep disputing it. Which is its own kind of lesson. Sometimes a title becomes real less through legal authority than through everyone else getting tired of contesting it. Now, the Mystery Man. Head northeast, out of Renaissance Italy and into the Baltic, to a state that was, by 1440, the largest in Europe, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And here's where the title gets complicated in a completely different way, because Lithuania's rulers didn't inherit an argument about legitimacy from the Pope. They had one of their own, running for over a century, about what to even call themselves. Take Gediminas, the ruler who founded Vilnius and expanded Lithuanian territory from the Baltic Sea nearly to the Black Sea. In his own letters to Pope John XXII, he styled himself Rex, Latin for king. The Pope's own chancery wasn't so sure that was earned. One surviving document hedges by calling him Rexive Dux, king or duke, as if the writer genuinely couldn't decide which was accurate. That's not a modern historian softening the record for balance. That's a 14th century clerk, in real time, unable to settle what rank the man in front of him actually held. It takes almost 100 more years, through Gediminas' sons, through a civil war between cousins, before the title finally locks into a fixed, settled form. Magnus Dux, Great Duke, Grand Duke. And the ruler under whom it finally settles is Vytautas, the same man we left hanging back in Rome. Here's a detail worth sitting with, because it's going to matter again later. In the Ruthenian language documents of that same court, the Latin Magnus Dux gets rendered as something else entirely. Veliki Knyaz, Great Prince. It's the exact same title, in the exact same court, wearing two different coats depending on which language you address the ruler in. Keep that phrase in mind. It's going to resurface, in a completely different country, doing a completely different job. Here's what's easy to miss in that century of argument over a word. This wasn't academic. A title in this period wasn't decoration. It was leverage, over neighboring rulers, over the Pope, over the Teutonic Knights who spent decades trying to conquer this exact territory. Getting the wording wrong could cost you an alliance. Getting it right could win you one. If that's the kind of detail that makes you want to know how any of these disputes actually got settled, that's worth a like. It's genuinely how more people end up seeing this kind of thing. Vytautas didn't just inherit the settled title either. He spent the peak of his own reign trying to trade it in for something bigger. We'll get to exactly how that ends, and it ends closer to Cosimo's story than you'd expect. So that's two systems down. A sovereign title born out of a papal workaround, and a princely title that took a century of argument to even settle on a name. Three stranger ones are still ahead, including one that got handed to a 5-year-old. This is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to do. Take a word everyone assumes is simple, and pull the actual, contested record out from under it. If that's useful, subscribing means the next one lands in front of you without having to go looking for it. Napoleon didn't invent the title Grand Duke, but he did something Cosimo and Vytautas never got to do. He handed it out like currency to whoever happened to be useful that year. In 1806, fresh off his victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon needed to reward his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, a cavalry commander who'd fought hard and well for him. So he carved out a stretch of German territory along the Rhine, called it the Grand Duchy of Berg, and made Murat its ruler. 2 years later, when a bigger prize opened up, the throne of Naples, Murat left Berg behind without a second thought. Grand Duke was a stepping stone. Nobody involved pretended otherwise. Here's where it gets stranger. When Murat moved on, Napoleon needed a new placeholder to sit on the Berg title until something more permanent could be arranged. So in 1809, he gave it to his own nephew, Napoleon Louis Bonaparte, son of his brother, the King of Holland. The new Grand Duke of Berg was 5 years old. French administrators ran the actual government in his name, while the child who technically ruled it was, by any reasonable measure, still learning to read. This is not a footnote. This is not an exaggeration for effect. This is the system working exactly as designed. Because in Napoleon's version of Grand Duke, the title was never really about the person holding it. It was about which family Napoleon needed to keep loyal that particular year. Poland got a version of this treatment too, and it comes with its own tangle worth clearing up. In 1807, Napoleon carved a new Polish state out of land taken from Prussia and put it under Frederick Augustus I of Saxony. Officially, it was called the Duchy of Warsaw, not Grand Duchy. Napoleon wanted Polish soldiers and Polish loyalty, but he did not want an independent kingdom sitting on Russia's doorstep. So he deliberately kept the title one notch smaller than Grand, let alone King. And yet, then and now, you will find it called the Grand Duchy of Warsaw constantly, in history books, in museum placards, even on some maps from the period. It's technically wrong, and it's said so often that wrong barely seems like the right word for it anymore. Historians are still not fully settled on how casually that gets treated in the literature. Genuinely not settled, not just textbook settled. If you've run into that exact confusion somewhere, the comments are open. Once Napoleon fell, you might expect all of this title inflation to get quietly undone. It didn't. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the victorious powers sat down to redraw the map of Europe, and rather than eliminating the Grand Duke rank Napoleon had been handing around, they mostly kept it, handing it to a fresh batch of rulers instead. Baden, Hesse, Oldenburg, both Mecklenburgs, Luxembourg, brand new that year. Before Napoleon, there had been exactly one real Grand Duchy in Europe, Tuscany, plus a brief, semi-bribed upgrade for Savoy a century earlier. By the middle of the 1800s, there were as many as 14 Grand Duchies running at once, most of them small German states that would have been called nothing more than a duchy or a principality 100 years before, which raises an uncomfortable question about what any of these titles were actually worth if 14 different rulers could hold the exact same one at the exact same time in states you could cross by carriage in an afternoon. There's an answer to that question, and it comes from the one branch of this story where the title lost all contact with territory entirely. And, fittingly, it's the same word we just tucked away a minute ago. Start with the word itself. In Russian, the term is Veliki Knyaz, literally, Great Prince. The exact same phrase, remember, that sat quietly behind Lithuania's Magnus Dux centuries earlier. But from the reign of Peter the Great onward, Western diplomats and translators rendered it into English, French, and German alike as Grand Duke, to make it sit neatly alongside the Western European rank. The problem is that a Western Grand Duke ruled a Grand Duchy. A Russian Veliki Knyaz ruled nothing. It was simply the birthright of every child, and every male-line grandchild, of a reigning emperor of Russia. You didn't earn it, conquer it, or negotiate for it. You were born, and the title came attached, the way a surname does. Here's the twist, though. The emperors handing out that empty courtesy title were, at the very same time, often personally holding a completely different Grand Duke title that came with actual territory attached. Alexander III, Emperor of Russia, King of Poland, was also, in his own official style, Grand Duke of Finland, ruler of an autonomous Grand Duchy that Russia had annexed in 1809. So in the very same sentence of his own royal title, Grand Duke meant two entirely different things: a real, governed territory in one clause, and, for every cousin and nephew in his extended family, nothing at all in the next. For most of the 1800s, that second, empty version of the title wasn't a small group of people. It kept growing, generation after generation, because emperors kept having children, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and under the existing rules, every single one of them qualified. Each Grand Duke came with a state-funded life annuity attached, reportedly around 280,000 rubles a year, according to the memoir of one of them, Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, who titled his own book bluntly, Once a Grand Duke. Each Grand Duchess came with a one-time dowry of 1,000,000 rubles on her wedding day. Multiply that by an entire, ever-expanding branch of cousins, and you get a treasury bill that starts to look less like tradition and more like a slow-motion emergency. So on July the 5th, 1886, a son is born to the emperor's first cousin, a boy named John Konstantinovich. A perfectly ordinary birth, except that under the existing rules, this particular baby, a legitimate, male-line great-grandson of an emperor, automatically qualified as a Grand Duke, with the annuity to match. 9 days later, Emperor Alexander III rewrote the rules. Going forward, the title of Grand Duke would belong only to the children and male-line grandsons of a reigning emperor, nobody further down the tree. John, whose birth had apparently been the final straw, was demoted to a lesser rank before he'd even been christened. He lived out his life as a mere prince. Sit with that for a second. An entire European royal title, the same 3 words that had once needed a papal bull, a furious Holy Roman Emperor, and 100 years of Lithuanian diplomacy to sort out, got trimmed back, midstream, over a budget line item. Not a war, not a succession crisis, an accounting problem, solved by demoting a newborn. That's the version of Grand Duke that most of these men actually lived. No duchy, no crown, no real power, just a title, a salary, and eventually, exile. As the historian Douglas Smith has documented, when the Russian Revolution arrived in 1917, most of the surviving Grand Dukes had nothing to defend, because there had never really been anything to defend in the first place. They fled to Paris and the Riviera, and wrote memoirs about a world that, strictly speaking, they had never actually ruled. Which brings us back, finally, to Vytautas, the ruler we left standing in Lithuania, chasing an actual crown of his own. In 1429, after decades of diplomacy, Vytautas got what Cosimo never managed, and what every Russian Grand Duke never even wanted: recognition from the Holy Roman Emperor himself of his right to be crowned King of Lithuania. A crown was built and sent. Polish magnates, alarmed at what an independent Lithuanian kingdom would mean for their own influence, intercepted it before it arrived. A second crown was made and dispatched. Vytautas died at Trakai Castle in October of 1430, just days before that second crown reached him. He never wore it. He died a Grand Duke, having spent the back half of his reign trying not to be one. That's the through line running under almost everything in this video. Cosimo wanted King of Tuscany, and the Pope gave him Grand Duke instead. Vytautas wanted King of Lithuania, and death gave him nothing at all, just the title he'd already held for decades. Even Napoleon's Poland wanted a kingdom, and got, deliberately, one small notch less. Again and again, across 400 years and 5 unrelated systems, Grand Duke is what ambitious men actually received in the exact moment they were denied the crown they were reaching for. Except once. Of all 5 versions of this title, exactly one is still in use today, still attached to an actual country, with an actual head of state. Luxembourg has been a Grand Duchy without interruption since the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and it remains, right now, the only sovereign Grand Duchy left on Earth. Its current ruler, Grand Duke Guillaume V, took the throne in October of 2025, when his father Henri stepped down after a quarter century on the job. A peaceful, constitutional handover, the kind that none of the men in this video would have recognized as remotely how their own titles worked. It's a strange note to end the taxonomy on. The one version of Grand Duke that actually functions as originally advertised, a real ruler of a real place, doing a real job, is also the only one still standing. So here's where all 5 threads land. First, the plain fact. Grand Duke, was never one title. It was 5 separate systems. A sovereign rank invented on the spot for one Florentine duke. A princely title that took 100 years of argument to even settle its own name. A piece of political currency Napoleon handed to allies and toddlers alike. A non-sovereign birthright that came with a treasury bill attached. And one lonely survivor still doing the job as originally advertised in Luxembourg today. Second, what that means for you, going forward, the next time you run into Grand Duke, in a novel, a headline, a museum placard, you now have a real question to ask, instead of a vague royal-sounding blur. Which of the 5 is this? Was there ever a duchy attached, or just a birth certificate? More often than not, the answer tells you something about power that the label was designed to hide. And if 5 feels like a tidy number to end on, it isn't, quite. Medieval Bosnia had its own Grand Duke, Veliki Vojvoda. A military court rank the monarch handed to his single most capable commander. For most of its existence, it wasn't even hereditary. It just followed whoever currently held the job. 5 clean systems is already a lot for one English phrase to carry. There's always a 6th exception hiding somewhere, if you go looking hard enough. Third, the part that actually stays with you. Cosimo wanted a crown and got a workaround. The Russian system handed out the label to infants and took it back over an accounting problem. And Vytautas, the one man in this whole story who came closest to the real thing, who had an emperor's own authorization and a crown already built and already on its way to him, died 3 days' ride from Trakai Castle, with it still in transit. He held the grand title his whole adult life. He never once wore the one he actually wanted. Here's my question for you. If you'd been John Konstantinovich, born a Grand Duke by every existing rule in 1886, then quietly demoted to a lesser prince 9 days later because the treasury couldn't keep affording the family, do you think you'd have spent your life resenting the title you lost? Or would you have simply never known any different? Tell me honestly, down in the comments. 5 systems, 1 word. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, a lot of very powerful men who never got the crown they actually wanted, and settled, instead, for sounding grand.